Welcome to Creepy Corner Stories, where the shadows tell their own terrifying tales. Tonight, we step inside the most chilling abandoned buildings, places where lost souls linger and nightmares come to life. If you dare to listen, be warned, because some doors once opened can never be closed again. So turn off the lights, be prepared, and let's begin. Story: The House That Watched. There was an old house on the edge of town. Everyone said it was cursed. It had been abandoned for over 50 years, but strange lights were sometimes seen inside at night. No one dared to go near it, except for Jake and his friends. One cold evening, they decided to explore. The front door was unlocked, creaking loudly as they stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in dark stains. It smelled of mold and something else, something rotten. As they walked deeper inside, they heard soft footsteps upstairs, but they were the only ones there. "Maybe an animal?" Jake whispered, trying to stay calm. Then the footsteps stopped, right above them. A loud bang echoed through the house, and the old chandelier swayed as if something had just passed through the room. Suddenly they heard a faint whisper. It was coming from the staircase. "Get out!" The voice was raspy, barely audible, but they all heard it. Terrified, they ran toward the front door, but it slammed shut on its own. The room grew colder. The whisper turned into laughter, low, guttural, and echoing from the walls. The lights flickered, and in the dim glow, they saw a shadow standing at the top of the stairs. Not moving, just watching. The door suddenly burst open, as if the house itself was spitting them out. They didn't think twice. They ran and never looked back. Later, Jake searched for the house online. He found an old news article. 50 years ago, a man had murdered his entire family there, and their bodies were never found. Some say their souls are still trapped inside, watching, waiting, and if you listen closely at night, you can still hear the whisper, "Get out!" Story: The Silent Asylum. There was an old asylum deep in the woods, abandoned for decades. People said the patients never truly left. Some claimed they could still hear screams from inside. One night, 4 friends, Lisa, Mark, Danny, and Sarah, decided to explore. The asylum was falling apart, its walls cracked and covered in ivy. The front doors were broken, hanging open like a mouth waiting to swallow them whole. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floor was littered with broken hospital beds and rusted wheelchairs. Faint writing covered the walls. "Help me! Don't let him in!" "Creepy," Danny muttered, shining his flashlight around. As they walked deeper into the asylum, the temperature dropped. A loud clang echoed through the hall like something had been thrown. "Probably just a rat," Mark said, trying to sound brave. Then Sarah gasped. "Did you hear that?" A faint whisper drifted down the hallway. It was a woman's voice, soft and shaky. "He's coming." Their flashlights flickered. Footsteps echoed from the darkness. Slow, heavy, coming closer. Then, the lights went out. Danny screamed. Lisa grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the exit. But Mark stood frozen, staring into the pitch-black hallway. A shadow moved, tall, thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then, in a voice that didn't sound human, it whispered, "Stay with us." Mark snapped out of his trance and ran. They all did. They didn't stop until they were out of the building. When they turned back, the asylum was silent. The windows covered in grime seemed to watch them. But when Lisa checked her phone later, she found a new photo in her gallery. It was taken inside the asylum. It showed all 4 of them standing together, and behind them was a 5th figure, a tall, thin man with hollow eyes, smiling. Story: The Forgotten Hotel. Deep in the mountains stood an abandoned hotel. Once a place for luxury, it was now nothing but a decaying ruin. Locals whispered that the last guests never checked out, because something inside wouldn't let them leave. Kevin and his 2 friends, Mia and Jake, loved exploring abandoned places. When they heard about the hotel, they had to see it for themselves. They arrived just before sunset. The grand entrance was covered in vines, the windows shattered, and the once golden sign was now rusted, barely readable. Ridgeview Grand Hotel. Inside, the lobby was frozen in time. A dusty chandelier still hung from the ceiling. Old suitcases sat by the front desk, as if their owners had left in a hurry. The air smelled stale, and the floor creaked beneath their feet. As they explored, they found a guest book on the counter. The last entry was dated June 12, 1958. It read, "He comes at midnight. Do not go to room 306. A loud thud came from upstairs. Probably just the wind, Kevin said, but his voice wavered. They climbed the dusty staircase, following the long, dark hallway. The old room numbers were barely visible. Then they saw it, room 306. The door was slightly open. Mia reached out to push it when, slam! The door shut on its own. The air grew ice cold. Then a soft knock echoed from the other side. 3 knocks, slow, rhythmic. Jake pulled Mia back. We need to leave, now. They turned to run, but the hallway was different. It stretched longer than before, the walls twisting, shifting. The doors lining the corridor were all slightly open now, and from inside each room, shadows moved. Then from behind them a whisper, "You checked in, but you won't check out." The last thing they saw before the lights went out was the door to room 306 creaking open, and something crawling out. They never made it back to their car. The next day, the hotel stood silent once again, waiting for its next guests. And if you ever visit, you might find a new entry in the guest book. Story: The School That Never Closed. There was an old school on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for years after a terrible fire, but people swore they could still hear the school bell ringing at night. Some even claimed to see shadowy figures standing by the windows. One evening, Alex, Jordan, and Mia decided to check it out. They snuck through a hole in the fence and walked up to the front doors, which creaked open as if expecting them. Inside, the hallways were covered in soot and ash. Desks were overturned, old books scattered on the floor. The air smelled of burned wood and something else, something foul. Then they heard it, a faint ding-ding-ding, the school bell. "That's impossible," Jordan whispered. "There's no power here." Suddenly, footsteps echoed down the hall, slow, uneven, coming closer. They ducked into an old classroom. Desks were still lined up, and faded writing covered the chalkboard. But as Alex's flashlight swept across the room, Mia gasped. The desks weren't empty. In every seat sat a figure, gray, unmoving, covered in dust. Their hollow eyes stared straight ahead. They looked like students. A deep voice rumbled from the hallway. "Take your seats." The door slammed shut behind them. One by one, the figures started to turn their heads toward them. Their mouths opened, but no sound came out, just a horrible, choking gasp. The room began to darken, the air turning ice cold. "We need to go. Now," Alex hissed, grabbing the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then in the silence, a new message appeared on the chalkboard, written by an unseen hand. "Class is in session. No one leaves." The lights flickered. The figures began to rise from their desks. And then, the door burst open. They didn't hesitate. They ran, hearing the sound of dragging feet behind them, chasing them, reaching for them. The second they stepped outside, everything went silent. The school stood dark and lifeless once again. The next day, Alex checked the town records. The fire had happened exactly 50 years ago that night. Every student and teacher inside had died, except one. The teacher had vanished, and some say he still waits for his next class to arrive. Story: The Cursed Hospital, based on a true story. In Thailand, there is an abandoned hospital called Bangkok's Sathorn Unique Tower, often called the Ghost Tower. Though it was originally meant to be a luxury skyscraper, financial troubles halted construction, and the unfinished building became a dark place filled with eerie stories. One of the most terrifying true stories comes from a group of urban explorers who decided to enter the hospital section of the building at night. They climbed the broken stairs, their flashlights flickering as they stepped over abandoned beds and rusted medical equipment. The deeper they went, the stronger the air smelled of something rotten. Then they reached the surgical floor. Everything was covered in dust, except for one operating table. It looked like it had been used recently. Fresh bloodstains covered the metal surface. Suddenly, they heard a soft beeping. One of them turned toward the corner of the room and froze. A heart monitor, unplugged, covered in grime, was flashing as if someone was lying there. Then came the whispers. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, turning into panicked voices speaking in Thai. They could only make out a few words. "Help me. He's coming." Before they could react, the doors slammed shut on their own. The windows, which had been broken, were suddenly covered in condensation, and words began to appear as if written by an invisible hand. "You shouldn't be here." The beeping turned into a flat line. Then, from the far end of the room, they saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was a woman in a patient gown, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. Her dark, empty eyes locked onto them. She let out a blood-curdling scream. The friends bolted for the exit, shoving open the heavy doors and running down the hall. But as they ran, they noticed something horrifying. Their own footprints had disappeared. It was as if they had never entered at all. To this day, locals refuse to enter the building at night. Many believe the spirits of those who died in the unfinished hospital still haunt its halls, forever waiting for someone to help them escape. Story: The Hidden Room, based on a true story. In 2015, a college student named Daniel moved into an old rental house with 2 roommates in Rhode Island. The landlord had told them the house was built in the early 1900s and had a few quirks, but nothing to worry about. A few weeks after moving in, Daniel noticed something odd. One wall in the basement didn't match the rest of the house. It looked newer, like it had been added later. Curious, he knocked on it and heard a hollow sound. There was something behind it. One night, armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, Daniel and his friends pried open the wall. Behind it, they found a hidden room, small, dark, and lined with soundproof padding. In the center of the room sat an old wooden chair with metal restraints on the arms and legs. Scattered across the floor were pieces of yellowed newspaper, all about missing people from the 1970s. Then they noticed something else. Scratched into the wall, as if by fingernails, were the words, "He watches from the closet." Suddenly, they heard a creaking sound from upstairs. Everyone was accounted for, but footsteps were moving across the floor above them. Slow, deliberate. Daniel grabbed his phone and called the landlord. When he asked about the hidden room, there was silence on the other end. Then, in a low voice, the landlord said, "You weren't supposed to find that." The next day, they moved out. A few weeks later, they checked the local records and discovered that the house once belonged to a man suspected of multiple kidnappings. He was never caught, and to this day, no one knows where he went. Story: The Smiling Man, a true story. In 2012, a man named Frank was walking home late at night in Seattle. It was around 2 a.m. and the streets were nearly empty. As he walked, he noticed someone in the distance, a tall, thin man in a suit, walking strangely. At first, Frank thought the man was drunk. His movements were unnatural, almost like he was dancing. Then, as he got closer, Frank saw something that made his blood run cold. The man was grinning. A wide, unnatural smile stretched across his pale face. His eyes were open far too wide, unblinking. He moved in exaggerated steps like a puppet on strings. Frank crossed the street, trying to avoid him, but as soon as he did, the man stopped moving. Then, without warning, he sprinted toward Frank. Not running, sprinting. His arms flailed, his head twitched, but his smile never faded. Frank turned and ran as fast as he could. He didn't look back, but he could hear footsteps pounding behind him. He reached his apartment, fumbled with his keys, and slammed the door shut. Silence. After a few minutes, he peeked through the peephole. The street was empty. The smiling man was gone. Frank never saw him again. But to this day, he avoids walking alone at night, because somewhere out there, the smiling man is still waiting. Some places are abandoned for a reason, but that doesn't mean they're empty. The walls remember, the shadows listen, and sometimes, the past refuses to stay buried. If you ever find yourself near an abandoned building, be careful. You might hear whispers when no one is there. You might feel eyes watching from the dark. And if a door opens on its own, don't go inside, because not everyone who enters makes it back out. Thanks for watching Creepy Corner Stories, where the darkness always has a tale to tell. Until next time, stay out of the shadows.